Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. There are places in the galaxy where silence is not absence, but hunger. Silence that stretches like a wound through the skein of time, swallowing not only sound, but remembrance itself. The Imperium of man, monolithic, stubborn, brutal, thrives on history, on chronicles etched into walls, minds, and blood. But there are rumors. Not rumors spoken aloud, not even in the hidden cabals of inquisitorial archives, but felt like a shiver in the soul. The idea that some wounds never scar because they were never known. Something ancient. Something forgotten, not through time or neglect, but through theft. A predator that does not slay the body, but erases the self. Imagine a creature that does not breathe, does not bleed, does not strike. It touches you and leaves no mark. Only the absence of your name in the minds of those who loved you. You vanish not in death, but in the unmaking of memory. This is the whispered fear, the lingering dread, that somewhere, buried under Terra's rock or drifting through the black between stars, the Imperium hides a race that consumes thought. Not myth, not metaphor. The Eaters of Memory. In the grim vastness of the Warhammer 40k universe, memory is more than just a function of the mind. It is the very scaffold upon which the Imperium clings to continuity, purpose, and the illusion of progress. In a galaxy scarred by a million wars and watched over by a moribund corpse god, remembering is a sacred act. It is in remembrance that loyalty is preserved, that betrayal festers, that saints are venerated and heresies reviled. The Mechanicus preserves the blueprints of ancient technologies not because they understand them, but because remembering is obedience. The Ecclesiarchy canonizes memory into ritual. Even the Astartes, forged for war, ground their very identities on lineage, glory, and the echoes of battles long past. Without memory, the Imperium would not merely be blind. It would cease to exist altogether. And so it is here, in this sanctified realm of thought and recollection, that the idea of the memory eaters becomes truly blasphemous. Not merely as Xenos, but as desecrators of the very fabric of imperial identity. To forget is not just a flaw, it is a sin, a threat, a horror deeper than daemons. What then, if forgetting is not accidental? What if it is engineered, inflicted, harvested? The silence between stars becomes terrifying not for what it lacks but for what it has lost. Where there should be records, there are voids. Where there should be tombs, there is only dust. Even the warp, chaotic and ever-thirsting, feeds on passion and memory alike. But what if something else stirs in that darkness, something that does not warp thought but swallows it whole? The Imperium has long waged war against forgetfulness in all its forms. The Black Library hides the darkest truths, precisely because knowing them carries risk. The Inquisition annihilates entire populations to suppress certain knowledge. But in this fanatical obsession with control, with safeguarding the past, there is a paradoxical vulnerability. A hidden terror that if memory can be consumed, if thought itself can be devoured, then all this desperate record-keeping is futile. One cannot fight what one does not know. And if knowing itself is the price of exposure, then the Imperium might already be infested, already infiltrated, already erased in pieces too small to notice. There are regions in the galaxy where ships emerge from the warp only to find logs rewritten, destinations forgotten, even names unspoken. Navigators mutter of tunnels in the immaterium that do not roar or burn, but softly bleed awareness. The black ships whisper of prisoners who arrive unnamed, and worse, unknown to any registry. Scholastica psychana instructors have spoken, under breath and with trembling hands, of cadets who forget their own mothers, their own faces. Surely these are merely the side effects of psycher trauma, of warp travel, of mental instability, surely. Yet doubt persists, and doubt, in the Imperium, is heresy's herald. To explore the Eaters of Memory is to ask whether there are regions of space or nodes of time where remembering is not allowed. Not by censors or lords or doctrines, but by something predatory, an entity or a race that sees memory not as sacred, but as sustenance. Their victims do not die, not always. Some live, hollow-eyed, nameless. Others forget only a day, a purpose, a word. And yet, over time, this adds up. Cultures crumble, wars are misfought, heroes are never born because their pasts have been unraveled before they could act. This is not just insidious, it is terminal. Think of the Black Rage, of visions and echoes that drive the Blood Angels to madness. Think of the way the Necrons, once so proud, were tricked into oblivion by the Citan. Memory is not merely narrative, it is defense. To lose it is to die while standing. And if the Imperium has encountered such beings before, if somewhere deep in the vaults of the Ordo Chronos or beneath the layered lies of the Administratum, the existence of the Memory Eaters is recorded, then those records would be the most dangerous knowledge in existence. Because to know them is to risk becoming unknown. To fight them, one must remember. But to remember them is to offer them a feast. The silence between stars may not be silence at all. It may be the lingering breath of something that has already fed, wiping clean all trace of what came before. The eaters of memory do not roar, they do not scream. They leave no monuments, no blood, no bones, only absence. And in that absence, the Imperium stares at itself and begins to unravel. There is a hypothesis buried in the shadowed margins of forbidden texts, spoken only in the hypothetical lexicons of those who delve into the pre-imperial dark. Those few rogue scholars and radical inquisitors who dare ask what predates the warp's awakening, what predates even the dominion of the old ones. It is here, amid myths too ancient for the Eldar to remember, that we find traces, half conjecture, half vision, of a race not made of flesh, but of presence, of thought, of consumption. Beings who did not wage war as we understand it, who did not conquer with ships or blades, but infiltrated by suggestion, corroded through absence. The Memory Eaters. They may not be Xenos in the conventional sense. Their form, if it could be called such, defies detection, perhaps even comprehension. They do not reflect light. They do not emit heat. They do not cause shadows, but instead the absence of shadows, an emotional dead zone. The warp, as vile and mutable as it is, thrives on emotion, memory, belief. But these creatures are the antithesis. Not warp-born perhaps, but something that exists on the inverse spectrum of cognition. Not daemons, not tyrannids, not any known species catalogued by even the Ordo Xenos. They are older, or perhaps they have always been. What if they emerged as a reaction? A counterweight to the psyker phenomenon, to the rising tide of emotional resonance that defines both the warp and the ascendance of sentience. For every candle, a darkness. Perhaps the Memory Eaters arose not from evolution, but from necessity, a parasitic balance to the spiraling psychic saturation of the galaxy. When thought became so abundant that it threatened to reshape reality, something began to prune it. Not aggressively, not obviously, but with surgical subtlety. A missing thought here, a forgotten lineage there, a name that slips the mind of an entire planet. Some theories suggest that they once waged war on the old ones themselves, not through armies, but through erasure. A war fought not on battlefields, but in the minds of civilizations. Structures found devoid of records. Dead cities whose language has no surviving root. Cultures that had no enemies, no diseases, and yet vanished. Could it be that these were not forgotten by chance or catastrophe, but by design? The old ones may have encountered the Memory Eaters and lost not their empires, but the very memory of having ruled them. The birth of the Necrontire and their pact with the Catan may be connected. The Citan, devourers of souls and stars, were drawn to material energy. But what if something else preyed on the immaterial? What if the Necrontire, desperate for eternal life, were also trying to escape the predation of the intangible? Their transformation into the Necrons, their surrender of biological mind for mechanical permanence, may not just have been about defying death. It may have been a rejection of vulnerability to beings who consumed thought. In the age of strife, when warp storms engulfed the galaxy and humanity turned in on itself, stories emerged of dream plagues, entire worlds where populations forgot how to speak, how to love, how to build. These were dismissed as metaphor, allegory for the collapse of interstellar culture. But what if they were true? What if the breakdown wasn't technological, but neurological? The marks of Memory Eaters would not be overt. There would be no ruins, no corpses, no smoking craters. Only populations that remember nothing, unable to explain their own downfall. The Emperor may have encountered them. In the Unification Wars, in the hidden laboratories of Terra, in his gene forging of the Primarchs. What if the scattering of the Primarchs was not purely the work of chaos, but also an attempt to shield them from something that could have unmade their souls before they ever grew into warriors? What if some of the missing lore, the erased Primarchs, were not purged because of their heresy, but because something ate the collective memory of their very existence? The memory eaters defy detection because their weapons are indistinguishable from natural entropy. People forget. Archives fail. Data degrades. It is a truth of life. But these beings weaponize it. They introduce gaps in memory so precise, so surgically placed, that an entire command structure collapses. They do not sow confusion, they plant absence. An assassin that does not kill its target but erases the target's motive, leaving the victim to abandon their task, forget their allies, dissolve into apathy, and they may still be here, feeding slowly, strategically, at the edges of comprehension. Not because they are weak, but because they understand that the most efficient feast is the one no one notices until it is far too late. There are fragments within the oldest volumes of the librarious archives that tell of wars which cannot be fully remembered, conflicts that leave behind no heroes, no villains, only an unsettling sense of incompletion. In a galaxy where record-keeping is akin to faith, these absences are more damning than fire or plague. Old campaigns are referenced in the margins of larger texts, but their content has been lost. Entire chapters of the Imperial war machine act with a void in their chronicle, as if some cosmic censor passed through the data slates of history and pressed delete. These are the forgotten wars, and they may be the scar tissue left by encounters with the memory eaters. Take, for example, the eerie gaps in the archives of the Great Crusade. The Imperium has an almost religious obsession with cataloging its conquests, every subjugated world, every compliance action. Yet, cross-referencing old deployment maps reveals voids. Star systems shown as conquered in one record are omitted entirely in others. Imperial commanders with no known birthplace, no known predecessors, but who were undeniably active for a time, commanding fleets in war zones that have no survivors or memorials. These gaps are often explained away as the result of poor preservation, data corruption, or the arrogance of rogue archivists. But what if something fed on those memories? What if a war was fought, not lost, but forgotten? The Horus heresy itself is steeped in mystery, especially when it comes to the two missing Primarchs. So much attention is paid to the betrayal of Horus, yet the 2nd and 11th legions are almost entirely absent from official records. Not erased, but neglected in a way that feels unnatural. Even the names of their homeworlds are gone. And while the common explanation is that the Emperor ordered them to be forgotten due to some great shame, it is worth asking, why would the Emperor, a being who crafted monuments to guilt and doctrine alike, remove something so thoroughly? What if he did not? What if the memory eaters feasted upon the souls of those legions, erasing not just deeds but identity itself? A silence imposed by starvation rather than decree? Even within the Inquisition, whose agents are tasked with preserving forbidden truths, there are murmurs of blank zones in their own histories. Ordo Chronos operatives speak of temporal distortions where memory itself warps, shifts, or vanishes altogether. Whole missions recorded only in the testimony of a single survivor, who, when interrogated, cannot recall who their comrades were, only that they were not alone. These are not the ravings of broken psychers, but documented anomalies, labeled as temporal aberrations or warp echoes. Yet the consistency of the effect, the erasure of communal memory, implies intent. Design. A predator. Astartes librarians have likewise reported peculiar dreams, recurring images of battles they do not remember fighting. One blood raven was found carving a foreign chapter symbol into the walls of his cell, sobbing without knowing why. When queried, he said only that he dreamed of a brother he had never met and could not name. The blood ravens themselves, shrouds about their origins, might be a living clue to a war that was consumed rather than won. If the memory eaters ever fought alongside or against them, what remains may be not history, but aftermath. There are also disturbing patterns in planetary disappearances. Not exterminatus events, not demonic incursions, just sudden silence. Astropaths cease receiving signals. Data relays fall still. In one case, a Forge world continued shipping materials for decades, yet no one could recall who ordered them. When the Adeptus Mechanicus investigated, they found automated systems operating with protocols no magos recognized, and servitors mindlessly producing components with no known application. The planet was placed under quarantine and redacted, not because of heresy, but because nothing made sense. Perhaps it had been a battlefield. Perhaps the victors forgot. Some speculate that the reason the Eldar lost so completely to Slaanesh was not only excess and arrogance, but because they had already begun to forget the enemy that truly hunted them. The Old Ones, if they ever fought the Eaters, may have recorded their defeat in minds long gone. Perhaps the Laughing God alone remembers, and this is why he hides in the webway, laughing not from joy but to guard against what silence would do to him. The Forgotten Wars are not simply absence, they are suspicion crystallized. They are the feeling that something should be there, a wound that aches with no visible scar, a campaign waged not for victory but for remembrance, against foes who win not by strength or number, but by turning the mind into a battlefield and devouring every trace of opposition until there is nothing left to avenge, to recall, or to resist. The Memory Eaters do not claim territory. They claim the right to be remembered. And in doing so, they make the galaxy smaller, colder, and infinitely more terrifying. Beneath the mountains of Terra, in vaults older than many stars, there are doors without names, guarded not by men, but by silence. These are the vaults of Null, imperial myths whispered in the deep reaches of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the Ordo Scriptorum. Sanctums built not to contain material danger, but conceptual annihilation. It is said that within these vaults lie artifacts, ideas, and perhaps even beings that are too dangerous not because of what they do, but because of what they unmake. The Memory Eaters, if ever truly encountered, would not be slain, but sealed. Not fought, but forgotten. To understand why the Imperium would go to such lengths to hide such entities, we must understand the scale of their threat. Daemons can be exorcised. Xenos can be eradicated. Even the Necrons, in all their horror, follow patterns. But a predator that erases purpose, lineage, and identity? That leaves a chapter master weeping over names he no longer recalls? That infiltrates the vaults of the mind as easily as others walk corridors? That is an enemy which breaks the very structure of human resistance. These vaults of Null are thought to be constructed using psychically inert materials, layered with anti-warp sigils and blank field emitters, a technology thought lost with the Sloth or perhaps stolen from the ancient devices of the Cetan. Entire zones where no psychic echo resonates, where no dreams flicker in slumbering minds. These are the places where Memory Eaters might be kept, if such a feat is even possible. Not destroyed but suspended in a state of cognitive starvation. No thought, no memory, no prey. The notion of nullity containment is whispered among the savants of the Ordo Malleus, described in footnotes that advise extreme caution, even in transcription. There are rumors of black ships that never reach their destination, instead rerouted into these vaults, carrying psychers not for sacrifice or tithe, but to lure and bind something that follows them. Something that cannot be explained to the captains or the crew, lest knowledge itself become a vector of infection. These ships vanish from the logs, erased not by accident, but by deliberate censure. Some speak of an ancient construct known only as the Silent Core, housed within the deepest of the Null vaults. Described in overlapping accounts as a sphere of blank glass suspended above a pit of unlit energy, it is said to pulse in rhythm with the collective forgetting of mankind. A machine not of human origin, perhaps not of any origin, that hums with hunger, yet cannot be understood. Some radical inquisitors believe it is not a containment, but a beacon, or a lure, that it calls to the Memory Eaters, drawing them in, keeping them close so the rest of the galaxy might sleep. The Sisters of Silence, Null maidens whose very presence erases psychic resonance, are thought by some to be more deeply tied to these vaults than the Imperium admits. While they serve aboard black ships and at the side of custodes, a fragment of their numbers is said to remain stationed eternally within the Null vaults, not as warriors, but as locks. Their minds, immune to psychic incursion, may form the final barrier. A human mind turned blank, an anchor of oblivion, may be the last line of defense against creatures who eat memory as sustenance. There are chilling stories, even among the custodes, of patrols dispatched into the vaults never returning, or returning changed. Custodians whose names vanish from the golden walls of the 10,000. When pressed, their brethren grow still and quiet, their faces drawn in ways no enemy ever wrought. They speak not of betrayal or failure, but of rooms that should not be entered, of thoughts that begin to fade even as they are spoken, of corridors where the past itself begins to slip. If the vaults of Null truly house memory eaters, then they represent the Imperium's most fragile and yet most crucial containment operation. Not because these beings are unstoppable, but because they are untraceable. Their infection spreads not through blood or warp resonance, but through forgetfulness. A misplaced report, a stammered order, a soldier who forgets his name and with it his cause. Only by walling them off from all mind can the Imperium hope to resist. But walls can crack, seals can fail. And if one ever did, how would we know? Would we recall the breach? Or would we sit by as stories lost their shape, faces lost their meaning, and empires lost the will to endure? The vaults of Null are not tombs, they are reminders that the greatest enemy of the Imperium may not come in flame or flesh, but as a whisper, a quiet unmaking, a hunger born not of cruelty, but of perfect, consuming silence. Among the faceless ranks of scribes and logicians in the towering data spires of the administratum lies a quiet but potent fear, a fear not of failure, but of forgetting. Not just the loss of records, but the loss of the very need to remember. The Scholastica conspiracy, as whispered among disillusioned adepts and radical inquisitors, proposes something unthinkable, that there exists a hidden function within the bureaucratic monolith of the Imperium, not to preserve memory, but to bury it. That behind the endless red tape and ritualized obfuscation, certain scribes are not merely inefficient, they are agents. Agents who catalog and erase, masking the predations of the memory eaters beneath the official narrative. The Adeptus Administratum, with its labyrinthine hierarchy and near-religious reverence for record-keeping, would seem the least likely place for such a conspiracy to fester. Yet it is precisely its complexity that enables it. Who questions a missing page among 10 billion? Who notices when a planetary report arrives with one less name, one less date, one less directive? Amid the rituals of ink and parchment, the deletion of memory can be sanctified, hidden behind official seals and classification codes so archaic they are understood by no living adept. This is where the Scholastica conspiracy operates, not in silence, but in noise. Burying the erasure of memory beneath the sheer weight of administration. There are whispers of specific sects within the Ordo Scriptorum, those rarely acknowledged even by their peers, who operate outside the chain of command. Dubbed the Grey Quill by rogue archivists, they are said to serve a dual function, repairing gaps caused by the eaters and obscuring the cause. Their work is part triage, part misdirection. When a memory eater consumes the recollection of a battle, a saint, or even an entire war, it is the Grey Quill who steps in to fabricate a suitable replacement. Saints are invented, dates are reassigned, conflicts are renamed. Not to deceive the populace, but to maintain the illusion that memory has continuity. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Scholastica conspiracy. Not its malice, but its necessity. These scribes are not heretics. They are loyalists, driven mad by their duty. They erase not because they wish to betray the Imperium, but because they believe the truth would cause collapse. A void in history, a break in the sacred chain of remembrance, could trigger civil disorder, religious panic, or worse, the collapse of faith. So they fill the void with half-truths, with doctored myths, with synthetic legacies. They turn lies into mortar and patch the crumbling cathedral of the imperial psyche. Some among the Inquisition suspect that the Scholastica conspiracy may extend even into the Lex Imperialis. Laws change subtly over time, precedents removed from the record, legal cases disappearing from the archives, leaving behind contradictory rulings that confuse and entrap even senior judges. These anomalies, when traced, lead to empty corridors in the data vaults, sectors where Vox signals refuse to transmit, rooms where scribes fall into stupors mid-task and awaken hours later with no recollection of what they were writing. Rooms that smell faintly of ozone and ink, though no ink has ever been spilled. Even more disturbing are the rumors of entire scholums, imperial education facilities, whose students emerge with impeccable obedience but fragmented memory. They know the creeds, the catechisms, the required oaths, but cannot recall the names of their own instructors or classmates or the layout of the dormitories they supposedly lived in for decades. These graduates are often assigned to quiet sectors of the Imperium, distant posts where administrative anomalies are common. Some vanish without further trace. Others rise quickly through the ranks of the Scriptorum, trusted not for their brilliance, but for their uncanny ability to work without question, without memory, without doubt. There is a theory, unproven and dangerous to even consider, that the Scholastica conspiracy may not be working against the memory eaters at all, but with them. That a bargain was struck long ago between desperate imperial savants and the predators of remembrance. A symbiosis. The eaters are allowed to feast, provided they do so with subtlety and precision, consuming only what the administratum allows. In return, they leave the broader edifice of the Imperium intact. This theory suggests the Grey Quill may not be defenders of humanity, but stewards of a terrible pact, keeping the monster sated and the illusion alive. Such an alliance, if true, would mean the Imperium's very knowledge is corrupted at its foundation, that even its most sacred truths are merely stitched-together garments draped over gnawed bone, that history is no longer something to be studied but something to be defended from within. The Scholastica conspiracy may be the last bulwark against a total collapse of identity, not through war or rebellion, but through a slow, inevitable unraveling of thought. They preserve the past not because it is true, but because it must be believed. And in doing so, they become something tragic. Not heroes, not villains, but gardeners in a field where the weeds eat the soil, where truth itself is a lie we dare not forget. There are saints within the Imperium whose names are sung across 1,000 cathedrals, their deeds etched in golden scripture, their visages immortalized in towering statuary. And yet, beneath that surface of reverence, there lies something strange. Subtle contradictions, fragmented accounts, inconsistencies that no amount of veneration can smooth over. Saints who appear in multiple timelines. Saints whose relics are found in places they never visited. Saints whose sermons are remembered, but whose voices are forgotten. These are not errors of history, nor are they heresies. They may be scars, left by encounters with the memory eaters. This is the quiet horror of saints who forget. Consider Saint Tarzia the Veiled, once a matron of the Calyx Expanse, credited with leading 1 million souls to faith amid the darkness of a warp storm. Her deeds are clear. Her sermons survive. Yet not a single portrait of her face exists. Not a sketch, not a mosaic, not a statue that dares show her features. When questioned, local ecclesiarchs claim it was her will to remain veiled. But one heretical scroll suggests she could not be pictured, not because she chose to remain hidden, but because her image could not be remembered, that those who looked upon her forgot, and that she herself did not know her own reflection. Saint Gillian of the Withered Choir is another anomaly. His name appears in hymns sung on opposite sides of the segmentum solar, in dialects that diverged thousands of years ago. The deeds are similar, the liturgies nearly identical, but the context, the worlds, the threats, all differ. Some believe he was a shard of the Emperor, a divine resonance. Others whisper a darker thought, that the real Gillian was consumed, and that what remains are echoes, memories left behind in different minds, stitched together by faith. A patchwork identity. All that survived the feast of something that devoured the true man. Even more chilling are the confessions recorded from pilgrims returning from sacred relic sites. Some weep at the foot of saintly bones, only to find they cannot recall why they were moved. Others claim to hear the voice of the saint in their minds, reciting sermons known to no cleric. The Ministorum often proclaims these to be miracles. But among the more jaded confessors, there are tales of gaps. Moments when entire groups forget the journey they just made, the prayers they just offered. Holy silences they are called. But not all silence is divine. Perhaps the most tragic are those saints who were never canonized, not because they failed, but because no one remembers what they did. Inquisition reports describe individuals who triggered mass conversions, ended heretical cults, even held back demonic incursions with nothing but faith. And yet their names vanish within days. Whole planetary shrines, built and abandoned within a single generation, stand empty. Statues weathered not by time, but by disuse. These are the saints who walk with the Emperor, but whose footsteps are lost, not erased by time, but stolen. There is a theory among certain exorcist chapters, those space marines trained specifically to endure demonic possession, that some saints may have survived encounters with the memory eaters, that they carry within them scars not of fire or blade, but of mental void. These saints are described as distant, even before their canonization, melancholic, prone to long silences, sudden forgetfulness, or paradoxical insight. Not because they were mad, but because they remembered something that tried to erase them. They became sanctified not for their power, but because they resisted unmaking. They remembered in defiance. These theories intersect with ancient fragments recovered from the Black Library, in which certain Eldar describe echo hollows, beings who retain their shape but lose their soul, becoming mouthpieces for forgotten gods. Some radical Ordo Xenos savants believe a few Imperial saints may be hollowed survivors, filled not with memory, but with something else, something that speaks in scripture, but hungers in silence. The ecclesiarchy, for its part, tolerates such discussions only at the fringes. To suggest that a saint's miracle was a consequence of resisting predation is to undermine the divine narrative. But in private, some confessors and cardinals admit to unease. That when they pray at certain shrines they feel not elation, but the dull ache of something lost. That there are names they used to know, names that trembled on their tongues but are now gone. Saints who perhaps still linger, not in memory, but in the void left behind. When saints forget, the Imperium mourns not just a soul, but a wound in the lattice of belief. For every forgotten saint, there is a gap in the armor of humanity's resolve. A place where certainty frays, where the enemy has already fed, and where all that remains is faith built on absence. A whispered prayer into a silence that never echoes back. There are regions in the galaxy where no signal answers, no fleet returns, and no memory persists. These are not the war-torn battlefields of chaos, nor the worlds scoured clean by exterminatus. These are the blackout zones, systems and sectors that are not simply lost, but erased. Their names remain on ancient star charts, yet every attempt to recall them, to speak of them, dissolves into unease or disinterest. They are places the Imperium does not fight for, not out of fear, but because it does not remember to. The segmentum obscurus is riddled with such spaces, clusters of stars with no imperial presence, despite ideal colonization conditions. Administratum records list these sectors as unremarkable, unclaimed, or pending survey, though their stellar configurations suggest previous contact. Explorator fleets sent into these voids either never return or come back with no logs of their journey, the minds of their crews disjointed, fragmented. There is no report of battle, no evidence of disaster, only silence, both external and internal. Those who do return often resign their commissions, plagued by a persistent sensation that they have forgotten something vital. They can draw no maps, recount no events, only that they were there and now they are here, and something is missing. Among the Adeptus Mechanicus, a term circulates in secret: null space drift. It refers to stars that show gravitational anomalies in the pattern of mass displacement, as if planetary or lunar bodies were once present but are now gone. But more chilling than the missing matter are the missing metrics, calculations that, when performed, result in inconsistent results every time. It is as though the very act of thinking about these places triggers a cognitive blind spot, a gap in logic the mind attempts to fill with falsehoods or simply abandons. Magi who pursue these questions too far often fall into recursive obsession, chasing data loops that erase their own assumptions, their own identities. One such zone, known colloquially as the pale thread, sits between the edges of the segmentum tempestus and ultima. It is a stretch of void dotted with dying stars and flickering warp echoes, where the astronomicon flickers erratically and gellar fields become unreliable. Ships that pass through are never the same. Vox logs degrade. Astropathic messages arrive garbled or in dead languages. More disturbingly, some vessels return bearing crew who were not aboard at departure, strangers who are listed in the ship's manifest, who wear the same uniforms, bear the same service histories, yet are unknown to any living crewman. These intrusions are not treated as threats, but as inexplicable anomalies. They are isolated, questioned, then often forgotten. Entire Forge worlds, too, have disappeared from the Mechanicus schema. Not destroyed, not overrun, but simply missing. The red-cloaked priests whisper of the cog dissonance, a syndrome in which an adept finds reference to a world that cannot be placed. Some recall names like Rexian, Volander Prime, or Orthes Major, worlds that once produced weapons and machinery of unmatched excellence, whose blueprints survive but whose locations do not. It is as if the tools outlived their makers, and the makers themselves were swallowed not by time, but by something that devours meaning. Inquisitorial dossiers recovered from dead agents mention certain inquisitors who obsess over these blackout zones. They trace threads of lost memory through dozens of systems, only to vanish mid-investigation. Their last messages often contain cryptic statements, "I have seen the blank," or "It is not absence, it is hunger." One especially grim log ends with the words, "I know now why we forget. It hurts too much to remember." These blackout zones often border regions of known psychic instability, leading some to believe that the memory eaters use the warp not merely to travel, but to digest. That each blackout is a feeding ground where the psychic residue of thought, history, and identity is stripped from entire systems. This theory suggests the zones are not random but patterned, that each is a node in a larger network, an invisible web of consumption. Astartes chapters with Deep Space Patrol mandates, like the Star Phantoms, the Exorcists, or the Iron Heralds, sometimes record unexplained absences in their chapter histories, whole fleets redeployed with no record of the cause, campaign medals issued without corresponding battles. In one chilling case, a dreadnought was found active aboard a derelict battle barge drifting in a blackout zone, its sarcophagus sealed and its memory banks corrupted. When reactivated, it recited battle hymns in a dialect not spoken for 9,000 years. Blackout zones are not absence in the traditional sense. They are wounds that do not bleed. They are screams that cannot be heard. They are the lingering effect of something that does not kill, but unhooks memory from time. To enter them is to gamble with selfhood. To chart them is to risk creating maps no one can read. And to understand them may be the last thought a mind ever holds. The Imperium, for all its might and dogma, is built on remembrance, of sacrifice, of betrayal, of divine truth. These zones are antithetical to that creed. They are regions where the narrative dies, where faith loses its script, where identity fades like old ink. And if the memory eaters are responsible, then every forgotten star is a banquet table, every lost ship a whisper swallowed, every missing name a victory carved in silence. In the forgotten margins of the Great Crusade, there is a tale, a whisper among the few librarians bold enough to seek truths lost in the warp, that one of the Emperor's noble legions may have made a pact darker than any demonic rite. A story not of corruption, but of desperation. A time when even angels feasted alongside the abyss. The tale is known by few as the Feast of Angels, and it tells of a Space Marine chapter that dined with memory eaters to secure a victory that no one remembers, for a war that may never have happened. The specifics are elusive, as if the tale itself recoils from being known, but fragments surface in the most unexpected places. A piece of illuminated script in the Black Library of Biel-Tan, showing Space Marines in communion with shapeless figures. A line in a stasis-warped battle hymn recorded by the Silent Sisters that references the Hollow Kin. A data slab recovered from a derelict watch fortress of the Death Watch. Its last entry corrupted except for one phrase, "We gave them our past to guard our future." Some believe the chapter in question was not one of the lost Primarchs, but a splinter or successor forged in the aftermath of the heresy, perhaps even an ultramarine offshoot tasked with exploring beyond the Emperor's light. They were sent to a region now categorized as a blackout zone, and what they found was not Xenos, not daemons, but silence that moved. They fought, not with bolters and blades, but with thought. And when their minds failed, when memory unraveled in real time, they made a choice, to feed their own recollections to the Eaters in exchange for continued resistance. This pact was not servitude, it was sacrifice. For every strategic decision retained, a memory of brotherhood was lost. For every victory preserved, a name was erased. Soon, the chapter became a ghost of itself. Warriors who remembered only their duty and nothing of who they were. Astartes who could recite codex drills flawlessly, but did not know the name of their Primarch. Chaplains who spoke litanies with no source. Dreadnoughts that screamed names that no record confirmed. In the centuries that followed, this chapter, if it survived, became something else. They may still serve the Imperium. They may walk among the Death Watch, the Crusade fleets, even the Grey Knights. But they carry no banners, no heraldry. Their armor is blank, their oaths empty of context. They exist only in function, and perhaps that is their penance, or perhaps their only protection. Among the more radical branches of the Ordo Astartes, there is a hypothesis that these feast marines are still active, deployed into the darkest regions of space where memory corruption is most severe. Their minds wiped before each mission, their purpose etched into the flesh with electro-sigils and skin ink. They do not remember what they fight, only that it must be fought. Their gene seed is rumored to be immune to psychic probing, not because of some biological enhancement, but because it holds no memory trace. Pure, unlinked thought, a perfect weapon against the memory eaters. Librarians who study the phenomenon tell of psychers encountering blank reflection zones during meditation, visions where they see armored figures fighting nothing, surrounded by the screams of the forgotten. These warriors seem familiar, but always just out of reach, their identities ungraspable. Attempts to scry deeper often end in seizure or comatose silence, as if even the act of knowing these warriors threatens their continued existence. The Feast of Angels is not a tale of damnation. It is a tragedy of martyrdom, so complete that even the martyrdom is unknown. It represents the ultimate sacrifice, not life, but legacy. To die and be remembered is heroism. To live and be forgotten is the price of victory in a war against forgetting itself. And if the memory eaters are real, if they can be bargained with, then this chapter may have been the only force in the galaxy to ever survive them without annihilation. The Imperium, in its cruelty and beauty, forgets with ease. But there are echoes. There are wounds in the warp that do not close. Battlefields with no name, where the grass grows in spirals and the wind speaks in borrowed tongues. Worlds where the only thing left of a war is a single, nameless marine standing sentinel among ruins that remember more than he does. And somewhere, perhaps, there is a vault where the records of this chapter are kept, not in ink, but in silence. A silence that feeds on what once was, and mourns the angels who fed it willingly. They were not traitors. They were not heretics. They were something far more terrifying. They were remembered, and then they were not. In the hidden corners of the Scholastica psychana, where the warp is not studied but endured, there exist training rites and psychic trials so secretive that even many inquisitors are denied knowledge of them. These are not simply methods of refining psychic power or instilling obedience. They are safeguards against the unspeakable, against contamination of thought, not by chaos, but by something older. Something colder. The memory eaters. Within the Scholastica psychana, there are dark rumors that some psychers are not merely tested, they are offered, that the black ships serve not only as collectors of sanctioned minds, but as tributes to an unseen predator that feeds not on flesh or soul, but on recollection. From the earliest age, Imperial psychers are taught to shield their thoughts. They are punished for errant visions, silenced for wild dreams, and for good reason. The warp is a place of reflection, and every uncontrolled thought is a beacon. But among the rarest lessons taught only to the Black Room instructors of the Scholastica psychana is the art of forgetting. Not suppression, not repression, but total, deliberate, strategic amnesia. These techniques are never explained. They are simply drilled into the psycher until memory can be severed like a limb. The why is never discussed, but the implication is clear. Some memories must not only be hidden from the warp, they must be hidden from whatever lies beyond, even its grasp. There are whispers of psychers who fail the Scholastica's rites not because they lack power, but because they remember too much. These individuals are not executed, nor are they consigned to the black ships. They vanish, quietly. No paperwork, no sermons. Rooms are reassigned, beds stripped, records amended. Instructors speak of cleansing vectors and null return protocols. Some believe these psychers are taken into the vaults of null, their minds fed as bait to memory eaters in rituals that both study and distract the predators. Others suspect these psychers are infected, harboring a kind of cognitive parasite that must be quarantined lest the rot of forgetting spread. A more radical theory holds that some black ships are not designed to bring psychers to Terra at all, but to intercept memory eaters in the void. Equipped with null fields, psychic dampeners, and cloistered servitor navigators whose thoughts are programmed, not lived, these ships serve as mobile banquets, luring eaters to feed upon pre-designated memories. In this theory, the psychers aboard are not sacrifices, but shields. minds constructed to mimic significance, to fool the predator into feeding. And once the eater has fed, the ship activates self-annihilation protocols, taking the creature with it into oblivion. The Sisters of Silence, who accompany the black ships, have their own legends. Though mute, they leave behind journals and blank script, readable only through psychic resonance. Some of these scripts speak of echo voids encountered mid-transit, periods when even their null presence cannot suppress the sense of being watched, not psychically, but conceptually. One sister records an incident where a young psyker aboard began reciting a nursery rhyme in a language no one had taught him, a language that seemed to erase itself from the logs minutes after transcription. Another tells of waking to find her own name missing from her ident tag, and the memory of her parents replaced by the sensation of falling. Even within the Scholastica psychana, there is institutional paranoia. Data slates are periodically wiped, not to protect secrets, but to remove the buildup of stray thoughts. Mind wiping is common for staff who change posts. And instructors are rotated not for efficiency, but because prolonged presence in certain locations leads to mnemonic decay. Some locations within the Scholastica, rooms of perfect silence, libraries with no indexes, meditation halls where dreams refuse to form, are treated with sacred dread. Not because of psychic taint, but because they are too clean, too empty. As if memory has been leached from the very walls. A few inquisitors have pushed further, tracing the psychic decay of certain high-level psychers across their careers. The pattern is alarming. The more experienced the psycher, the more fragmented their memory. Not trauma-induced fragmentation, but surgical loss. Some lose decades, languages, even basic motor skills. When interrogated, these psychers often speak of dreams within dreams, of being watched by things that ask questions without voice. One particularly powerful psycher, before his death, scratched a phrase into the wall of his cell: "They eat what we are before we become." Whether these occurrences are caused by demonic influence, the warp itself, or the memory eaters, the pattern is undeniable. There is something in the Scholastica psychana that does not just train psychers, it culls memory. And if the memory eaters are involved, then it may be that the Imperium has chosen to fight them with minds crafted as weapons. Minds trained not just to kill, but to forget. Not because forgetting is safe, but because remembering might feed the enemy. There are moments in the quiet between dreams when a thought intrudes that feels foreign, not merely unexpected, but alien. A memory that does not belong to you, an emotion without origin, a face you mourn without ever having seen. These are often dismissed as echoes of the subconscious, fragments of past lives or stray warp impressions. But what if they are not dreams at all? What if they are leftovers, remnants implanted by something that feeds not only to destroy, but to reshape? This is the true terror posed by the memory eaters, that they may not only erase thought but replace it, that they unmake identity and then remake it in forms they control. The Imperium understands the power of memory. Its doctrine is built upon repetition, tradition, and ritual. Identity is not fluid, it is forged and fixed. Yet among some inquisitorial enclaves and radical psychers, there is a growing fear that not all minds under Imperial rule are their own. These theorists suggest that memory eaters do not simply consume the past, they recycle it, implanting false narratives, synthetic emotions, and alien loyalties into the gaps they carve. This is not possession, it is worse. It is transformation so seamless that the victim never knows it happened. Imagine a governor who believes she rose through merit, but whose memories of service were grafted from 3 separate individuals. A magos who recalls a sacred pilgrimage that never occurred, whose faith is built upon manufactured experience. A soldier who bleeds for a cause he cannot name, but follows orders embedded like software. These are not merely victims, they are tools. Memory-crafted agents, embedded within the Imperium itself, loyal not to the Emperor, but to something older, colder, and infinitely more insidious. The Blood Angels speak often of inherited memory, the red thirst, the black rage, echoes of sanguinius imprinted upon their gene seed. But what if these echoes were not always voluntary? What if some of these ancestral resonances were the work of the Eaters, using the bloodline itself as a conduit for false legacy? Could the rage they feel be not only genetic, but manipulated memory? Could loyalty itself be an implanted instinct, manufactured long ago in battles that no one recalls. In one chilling case recorded by the Ordo Hereticus, an entire convent of the Adepta Sororitas was found worshipping a figure they called the Gilded Saint, a martyr none outside their world had heard of. When interrogated, the sisters recited sermons, displayed relics, even produced psalm fragments. But no record of the Gilded Saint existed in the ecclesiarchal annals. And worse, each sister described the saint differently. One saw him as a child, another as an old woman, another as a blinding flame. When shown recordings of their own testimony, they reacted with confusion, insisting they had spoken of the same person. None could recall the discrepancy. It was as if their memories had been harmonized to a lie. This incident, now redacted under the code name Chalice Echo, is considered by some a direct sign of memory eater infection. Not a feeding, but a rewriting. A mental virus that spreads through belief, grafting false saints into the spiritual architecture of humanity. The implication is horrifying. That entire cults, even sects of the ecclesiarchy, may be operating on histories fabricated in the void. That the eaters are not content to erase, they create. Among rogue navigators, there are whispered tales of warp routes that no longer exist on star charts, but which reappear in dreams. Paths to worlds with perfect cities, golden skies, and endless peace. Worlds they feel they visited, though no evidence supports this. The navigators speak of a hunger to return, a longing so intense it overrides duty. Some abandon their ships entirely. Others alter their charts in secret. When confronted, they break down, weeping for homes they never had. These false homes may be psychic implants, memories engineered to distract or derail Imperial navigation, to send ships into traps laid millennia ago. The implications for Imperial society are staggering. If memory eaters can insert thoughts, they can steer policy, shape doctrine, even engineer rebellion. What appears as heresy might be something more fundamental, a rearrangement of collective memory. Belief rewritten, loyalty redirected, all without a single gunshot. Civil wars started by empires that do not exist. Uprisings led by leaders who were never born. Faith based not on divine truth, but on whispers from the void. This form of warfare, thought infiltration, is perhaps the most dangerous in the galaxy. It bypasses defenses, renders logic impotent, and cloaks subjugation in consent. If the Eaters are truly capable of such acts, then the Imperium is not at war with an enemy in the stars, but with parasites in its own mind. And how do you fight what lives within your thoughts? How do you purge a memory if you don't know it's false? How do you rebel when the command to obey feels like your own voice? In a galaxy of tyrants, demons, and monsters, this is the most intimate horror, that you are not you. That your beliefs are implants, your faith a script, your past a shadow cast by something that does not wish to be known. Dreams that were not yours. Lives that were never lived. Truths that once removed leave behind nothing but a shell, perfectly loyal, perfectly false. Upon the golden throne, the Emperor of mankind dreams not in silence, but in storms. For 10,000 years he has sat at the heart of Terra, encased in a necrotech reliquary of pain and power, holding back the tides of the warp with thought alone. But thought, in its purity, is memory. And what happens when memory fades? Not by age or entropy, but by design? There is a theory, feared even by the Ordo Malleus, that the Emperor himself once knew of the Memory Eaters, and that to preserve the galaxy from them, he sacrificed more than his body. He sacrificed remembrance. The signs are there, hidden in the most sacred vaults of the Imperium. The Emperor, master of all sciences and psychics, designed the Primarchs with identities carved from ideals. He crafted not just warriors, but symbols, memory anchors meant to shape the human future. Yet 2 of these anchors were removed, not with rage but with eerie precision. Their erasure was not just historical, it was ontological. No records, no relics, no cultural echoes. As if something had consumed them whole. And some believed this was the Emperor's doing, not to punish, but to hide them from the Eaters. During the Unification Wars, ancient data vaults describe strange campaigns fought not against warlords or mutant strains, but against the blanking. Settlements where names no longer held meaning, where citizens forgot how to speak, where every page turned blank before the reader's eyes. These phenomena were never attributed to chaos. Instead, they were simply ignored, redacted, explained away as psi storms or warp bleed. But what if these were the earliest incursions of memory eaters? What if the Emperor, even then, recognized the threat and began to contain it, not with force, but with concealment? The Golden Throne, whose purpose is shrouded in half-truths and myth, was originally a device of unimaginable psychic reach. Some suggest it was built not only to sustain the Astronomicon, but to act as a prison, a mental anchor holding something at bay, a being or beings that existed not in space, but in thought. The throne may not just project light, it may guard against darkness, a darkness that lives within forgetting, that seeks to feed on the Emperor's memories, to unravel his design from the inside. The daily sacrifices of psychers to sustain him are seen as a necessity for the Astronomicon's fire. But among the Adeptus Astrotelepathica, there is an alternate interpretation, that these psychers do not fuel the light, but protect the Emperor from being devoured. That their minds, rich with memory and thought, are fed to the eaters on his behalf, an endless diversion to keep their hunger from turning inward. This would explain the urgency, the constant collection of psychers, the obsessive maintenance of the throne's systems. Not to empower the Emperor, but to preserve his identity against consumption. In the deepest catacombs of the Imperial Palace, where only the Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence dare tread, there are vaults not of artifacts but of names. Preserved thoughts, encapsulated identities, whole personas locked in crystal stasis, stored like weapons. The theory goes that these are fragments of the Emperor's own mind, shards severed to prevent infection. Memories too dangerous to be held, but too vital to be lost. If a memory eater ever reached the throne, these fragments could serve as backups, restoring the Emperor's self in the face of mental collapse. And yet, there are signs that some memories have already been lost. The Emperor no longer speaks. His will is expressed only through psychic force. Some say he is withdrawn, dreaming deeper than ever before, not in meditation, but in struggle. That every second on the throne is a war, not against chaos, but against oblivion, against an enemy that cannot be named because naming it might feed it. That his silence is not choice, but strategy. That to remember aloud would be to expose what must remain buried. This perspective casts a terrible light on the history of the Imperium. Perhaps the wars we fight are distractions. The heresies we burn are echoes of battles long lost, not in blood, but in thought. Perhaps the true struggle is invisible. A war waged in the deepest vaults of mind, where the Emperor fights not with legions but with identity itself, holding fast against predators that would erase even the idea of resistance. What does he remember? Do the names of the lost Primarchs still flicker behind his closed eyes? Does he recall the faces of the loyal, the betrayed, the forgotten, or have even those been taken? If so, who holds them now? Who feeds on the mind of the God Emperor? And if he forgets us, what are we? The tragedy is profound. The Emperor in his triumph may be alone not just in flesh, but in memory. A being who once knew everything, now guarded from the very thoughts that gave him purpose. And as the Imperium crumbles, as planets fall and truths twist, we must ask, what happens if he forgets why he built this empire at all? What happens if the last light of man is simply forgotten? In the end, we must ask ourselves what it means to fight an enemy that consumes not territory, not flesh, but the very framework of identity. The eaters of memory, whether ancient Xenos, warp-born phenomena, or conceptual predators beyond even the gods, represent a threat unlike any other. They do not scream through the immaterium or strike from the stars. They do not challenge the Imperium openly. They do not even demand surrender. They simply unmake, quietly, absolutely. Where no thought can follow, the Imperium falters, not in battle but in belief. This is a universe built on remembrance. Every shrine is a story. Every chapter is a legacy. Every scar a truth etched in bone. But what happens when that story is unwritten? When that legacy is redrafted by an unseen hand? When even the scars vanish, leaving only the illusion of wholeness? This is not heresy. It is nullity. It is the erasure of context, the devouring of meaning. It is what the eaters offer in exchange for silence. The final horror is not destruction. It is replacement. In a future where memory eaters prevail, the galaxy may still burn with war. Ships may still roar through the void. Planets may still cry out in worship. But none of it will matter. Because none of it will be real. Humanity, unmoored from its past, will march like sleepwalkers into battlefields they do not understand, for causes they do not remember, against enemies they cannot name. Loyalty will become instinct. Faith, programming. And victory, a word said out of habit with no triumph behind it. Imagine a galaxy where the God Emperor is still revered, but no one knows why. Where the name Imperium is spoken with awe, but its origin is lost. Where saints are worshipped who never lived, and worlds are mourned that never existed. Where every citizen acts their part with perfect discipline, but no soul remains beneath the ritual. This is the true victory of the Eaters, not in death, but in simulation. A perfect empire, empty of meaning. A legacy so thoroughly devoured that even the hunger it fed can no longer be named. Yet there is resistance, not in armies, but in memory itself. Every archivist who hides a forbidden record, every psyker who risks madness to hold on to a vision, every marine who carves the name of a fallen brother into ceramite. These acts are sacred. They are weapons, not because they preserve data, but because they affirm self. They assert, against all odds, I was, I am, I remember. Perhaps the greatest defiance is the act of storytelling itself. In a universe that seeks to unwrite you, to turn every soul into a blank page, to make history a void, telling the truth, no matter how fragile, is rebellion. And so we speak of the memory eaters. Not because we are sure they exist, but because not speaking of them would be surrender. Their threat lies not just in their nature, but in our silence. And through stories, through myth, through shared remembrance, we draw the line. We say, here is where we remember. Here is where the darkness cannot pass. So if you felt the edges of your mind shiver, if you've caught a name on the wind that you never learned but somehow missed, if you've woken with tears for a face you cannot place, you are not alone. You are part of the defense, part of the resistance, part of the Imperium's last and most sacred bulwark, the will to remember. And if this story resonated, if it sparked a flicker of recognition in the corners of your soul, then keep it alive. Speak it, share it, let the fire pass hand to hand, memory to memory. Because in this war, every thought is a blade, every truth a torch, and every voice that remembers is one more shield against the dark. Subscribe for more forbidden lore from the galaxy that forgot to die. Stay vigilant, stay human. Remember,